the steps were, and I turned left. She was just laying there. Little girl. I knew she was dead. I mean, how do you do this to your own 7-year-old?
Most of all, I want to acknowledge the children who are terrified and suffering at this moment, and the many people for whom this legislation comes too late. The women who have suffered through this system with little or no support, who still carry the pain and trauma of their abuse, the young adults who have survived abuse and emerged stronger, not because of the child protective system, but despite it, and the women and children who have died, who could have been saved. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kayden. Hi, I'm Kayden.
This story may be extremely upsetting for some viewers. It involves the death of a child, systemic failure, and a devastating betrayal by someone meant to protect her. Please proceed with caution. August 5th, 2018. A man walks into a quiet home in Manayunk, Pennsylvania. He calls out for the little girl he helped raise, hoping she'll come running, but silence greets him. He climbs the stairs. At the top, he turns left and stops. There, lying lifeless on the floor, is 7-year-old Kayden Mancuso. Her shoes are still on. A plastic bag is tied tightly over her head. Beside her, a note lies on the ground. "You got what you deserved. I had the last word." Her father, who had been granted unsupervised visitation despite dozens of warnings, had used a 35-pound dumbbell to end her life before hanging himself upstairs. Today, Kayden's name is echoed in the halls of Congress, etched into federal law, and remembered by presidents and movie stars. But none of it can bring her back. Her family didn't want a legacy. They wanted Kayden to come home from that weekend, to tell her little brothers a silly story, to brush her teeth and giggle at bedtime. Instead, they buried her in a white casket, wearing the flower girl dress she once twirled in. This is the case of Kayden Mancuso, a little girl whose smile lit up rooms, whose love was pure, and whose death became a rallying cry across the United States. A tragedy that should have been prevented. A system that chose parental rights over a child's safety. A warning for every judge, every lawmaker, and every parent who ever trusted the court to do what's right. Let me tell you her story. Her name was Kayden Catherine Mancuso. She was born on October 15, 2010, in Trenton, New Jersey, a place where her mother remembers holding her for the first time, her tiny fingers wrapped around hope itself. From the moment she opened her eyes, Kayden had a light. It wasn't just the sparkle in her big, curious eyes or her long, flowing blonde hair. It was the way she smiled. It was genuine, radiant, the kind of smile that made adults stop and remember what innocence looked like. Kayden wasn't just sweet, she was magnetic. Wherever she went, children wanted to be near her, play with her, sit next to her in class. Adults found themselves disarmed by her kindness and wit. Her laugh was full-bodied, and when she laughed, others couldn't help but laugh too. She loved unicorns, mermaids, LOL surprise dolls, and anything sparkly or pink. She was a huge fan of the Philadelphia Eagles and the Phillies, a little sports girl with big opinions. She sang all the time, especially her favorite song, Fight Song by Rachel Platten, a track that now feels painfully prophetic. "This is my fight song, take back my life song," she would belt out, the lyrics echoing with a strength that no 7-year-old should ever need. At Edgewood Elementary School, Kayden earned straight A's and was beloved by teachers and classmates alike. Her first grade teacher, Jocelyn Setzman, described her as joy and light. She wasn't just bright, she had grace, both on and off the field. Whether playing with the Pennsbury Gems 10U softball team, dazzling in gymnastics, or shining in beauty pageants, Kayden gave her all. She was the kind of child who stayed behind to help others, who remembered her friends' birthdays, who drew pictures for her little brothers and taped them on their doors. At home, she was the heartbeat of the Sherlock family. The house where she lived with her mom, stepdad Brian, and 2 younger brothers. She had her own room, her own little world filled with glitter pens and handmade crafts. With Brian, she had more than a stepdad. She had a coach, a protector, a best friend. They tossed the ball in the yard, played board games, and ended every night with a promise. Let's finish on a good note. Kayden was flourishing, not just surviving, but thriving. She loved her family. She loved life. And above all, she trusted the adults in her world to keep her safe. That trust would soon be betrayed in the most horrific way imaginable. The story of Kayden's family begins in the summer of 2009, along the sunny shores of the Jersey coast. That's where her mother, Catherine Sherlock, met Jeffrey Mancuso, a man who, on the surface, seemed charming, witty, and successful. He owned a staffing business and knew how to make people laugh. But behind the charisma lay a much darker truth. Their relationship was never meant to be long-term. It began as a casual affair. When Catherine became pregnant, they made a decision to live together for the sake of the baby. But even then, they slept in separate rooms. There was no love, only the illusion of a family. Jeffrey had a troubled past, one that was well documented and deeply concerning. According to his sister, Allison, his emotional stability shattered after a childhood car accident that left him with a traumatic brain injury. From that moment on, he was never the same. Violence, outbursts, and erratic behavior followed him into adulthood. In high school, he was expelled for fighting. He once struck a teacher. Alcohol became his crutch. Despite these red flags, he managed to graduate from Towson University and start a company. But the success in business didn't translate to success as a human being. During Catherine's pregnancy, the emotional abuse escalated into physical violence. One night, Jeffrey shoved her from a chair. On another, he strangled her, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she thought she was going to die. Still, she stayed. For Kayden. When their daughter was born in October 2010, Jeffrey showed signs of warmth. He cradled her in his arms, smiled in photos, played the part of the doting father. There were trips to the beach, vacations to Disneyland, Halloween costumes side by side. But darkness lingered just beneath the surface. By New Year's Eve of 2012, everything changed. During a drunken fight at a bar, Jeffrey bit off a part of another man's ear. To a psychiatrist, he later described the event coldly, as if biting a stranger's ear off was just another story. It was the final straw. Catherine packed her bags and left with Kayden, desperate to protect her daughter from the chaos. In 2014, a man named Brian Sherlock entered their lives. He had 2 young sons of his own, and from the start, Kayden embraced them like real siblings. She helped care for the baby, played with her new brothers, and grew close to Brian, who would become not only her stepfather, but her safe harbor. In 2016, Brian and Catherine married. Kayden wore a white flower girl dress and danced at the reception. For the first time in years, she had stability, laughter, and a father figure who treated her with love, not fear. But this newfound joy sparked something dangerous in Jeffrey. As he watched from afar, through social media, from court documents, he saw Kayden growing up happy, healthy, and, most painfully for him, without him. His control was slipping, and for a man like Jeffrey Mancuso, that was unforgivable. In 2017, he retaliated, not with violence, but with paperwork. He filed for partial custody. He didn't want to be a father. He wanted leverage. Less custody meant more child support. More custody meant control. Representing himself in court, Jeffrey launched a campaign of harassment, filing dozens of police reports against Catherine, making threats, attacking their family dog in front of Kayden, and even striking his own mother. At school, Kayden confided to a counselor, "I'm scared of Daddy." She said he made her rehearse what to say to the judge, that he screamed at her, that he told her, "I hate you." Despite all of this, despite the psychiatric reports describing him as narcissistic, unstable, and violent, Judge Jeffrey Troger still granted him unsupervised weekend visits with Kayden in May 2018. Treatment was recommended but not required. That ruling would turn fatal. August 4th, 2018. A warm Saturday afternoon. 7-year-old Kayden Mancuso stood at the door of her home, holding tightly to her stepfather Brian's hand. She looked up at him and whispered the words that would echo through his soul for the rest of his life. "I love you, Bree." Then, reluctantly, she walked toward her father's white 3-story home on Wild Street in Manayunk, Pennsylvania, for what was supposed to be just another weekend visit. What happened inside that house over the next 24 hours is known only through forensic evidence, crime scene analysis, and the haunting remnants left behind. But the picture is devastatingly clear. Jeffrey Mancuso planned this. Days before the visit, he bought a 35-pound dumbbell, prepared plastic bags, coiled an iPhone charging cable, and penned a 2-page suicide note. He wasn't preparing for a weekend with his daughter. He was preparing for a murder-suicide. On Saturday morning, neighbors saw Jeffrey and Kayden walking to a grocery store. In the afternoon, they stopped at an ice cream shop, but something felt off. Kayden was uncharacteristically quiet. She barely smiled. Employees later said she sat silently, eating her ice cream, while her father talked on the phone, disengaged from her completely. The joy in her eyes, the sparkle that usually followed her, was gone. By Sunday morning, something inside Kayden must have told her she was in danger. Maybe it was his behavior, maybe it was a look, but she remembered what her mother had once told her. If you're ever scared of Daddy, run. And she did. She ran for the front door, laced up her sneakers, and tried to flee. She almost made it. But just as she reached the threshold, Jeffrey caught her. In his hands was the 35-pound dumbbell. He struck her in the head multiple times with such force that each blow was fatal. But even that wasn't enough for him. He pulled a plastic bag over her small head and tied it tightly with the iPhone charger, ensuring no breath would escape and no one could save her. Her body was found lying by the door, her shoes still on, right where she'd tried to run. Jeffrey went upstairs, washed the blood from his hands, and left behind the note. "You got what you deserved. I had the last word." Then he hanged himself with a belt in the bedroom. That evening, Catherine and Brian began to worry. Jeffrey was supposed to bring Kayden home by 6 p.m. He didn't show. Calls went unanswered. At 10:30 p.m., they drove to the house. It was dark. No one answered the door. They called police begging for help. But the responding officer told them they'd need a warrant to enter, a mistake that a homicide detective would later confirm was incorrect. The officer had the authority to go in, but he didn't, so they went home and waited. The next morning, August 6th at 10:50 a.m., Brian returned with Kayden's grandfather. The back door was unlocked. Brian entered first. He walked up the steps, turned left, and saw her. Kayden's small body lay still by the front door. She was dressed. Her shoes were on. A plastic bag covered her head. The man who had loved her like a daughter collapsed in tears. Kayden was dead, killed by the very man the court had told her she had to spend weekends with. A man everyone said was dangerous. A man who had been given unsupervised access despite every warning. The aftermath of Kayden's death was a collision of grief, fury, and disbelief. It wasn't just the brutality of the act. It was the fact that everyone had seen it coming and no one had stopped it. When police finally entered the Mancuso home, they discovered the harrowing scene exactly as Brian had described. Kayden's body near the door, her father's suicide note, cold and calculated. Upstairs, Jeffrey's lifeless form hung from a belt. In the bathroom sink, traces of blood revealed he had tried to wash away his crime. But there was no erasing what he had done. Investigators quickly compiled the evidence. The 35-pound dumbbell, smeared with blood. The plastic bag and iPhone charger used to asphyxiate her. The 2-page handwritten note, showing clear premeditation and vindictive intent. But no arrests would be made. No trial would be held. The killer was already dead. Instead, the scrutiny turned toward the court system. How had this happened? Why had Judge Jeffrey Trager, despite hearing from teachers, coaches, and even Jeffrey's own family members, still granted unsupervised custody? Not a single witness had spoken in Jeffrey's defense. Not one person had stood up in court and said, "This man is safe." The psychiatric evaluation was damning, diagnosing him with major depressive disorder, narcissistic personality traits, antisocial behavior, and suicidal ideation. Experts explicitly recommended that visits be conditional on psychiatric treatment, but Trager ignored that recommendation. Instead, he issued a detailed custody schedule for holidays, birthdays, and weekends, one that would never be used. In the weeks that followed Kayden's death, Catherine Sherlock and Brian Sherlock found themselves buried not only in grief, but in legal loopholes and bureaucratic silence. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit, hoping to hold the court accountable. but they were told that judges in Pennsylvania have full judicial immunity. The lawsuit was dismissed. There would be no disciplinary action against Judge Troger, no internal review. No one was held responsible. The detective assigned to the case later admitted that officers should have entered the house on the night of August 5th. That mistake, those few lost hours, might not have changed the outcome, but it underscored the same systemic failure that had haunted Kayden's entire short life. When danger was clear, the people in power did nothing. So instead of a courtroom, Catherine turned to Congress. She began to advocate for change, determined to make sure no other child would be lost the way Kayden was. Her pain became her mission, and that mission began to gain momentum. The news of Kayden Mancuso's murder sent shockwaves across Pennsylvania, and then across the country. But the outrage wasn't just about the brutality of her death. It was about what allowed it to happen. The system had failed a little girl who had cried out in fear, and when the court didn't listen, it signed her death sentence. Thousands joined the outcry. Vigils were held. One by one, people gathered with candles, signs, and turquoise t-shirts, the color Kayden loved most, demanding reform. Protesters held up unicorn posters because unicorns were Kayden's favorite. And behind every candle, every chant, every tear was the same haunting question. Why didn't anyone stop this? At Edgewood Elementary School, her first grade teacher stood before a crowd of parents and children and said, "Kayden brought light to every day I spent with her. She deserved better." On August 11th, 2018, more than 200 people gathered at St. John the Evangelist Church to say goodbye. Kayden lay in a small white casket, dressed in her cousin's communion gown. Her flower girl dress no longer fit. In the pews, her classmates whispered memories. Outside, grown men cried. But even amid the heartbreak, something powerful began to grow, a movement. Kayden's mother, Catherine Sherlock, instead of withdrawing into grief, began traveling across the country, sharing Kayden's story. Her voice, once trembling, became strong. Her message was simple: no court should ever prioritize a parent's rights over a child's safety. With the support of lawmakers and advocates, Catherine helped draft and champion a bill called Kayden's Law, a federal initiative to change how custody decisions are made in cases involving domestic violence or mental illness. It called for mandatory consideration of a parent's history of abuse, restriction of expert witnesses to qualified specialists, required training for judges on trauma and family violence. In March 2022, in the East Room of the White House, President Joe Biden signed the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, which included provisions of Kayden's Law. A photo from that day shows the president embracing Catherine after the signing, a moment that captured both sorrow and triumph. Behind the legislation, behind the ink on the page, was the image of a girl who loved singing, fight song, and drawing unicorns. Angelina Jolie, who had become a fierce advocate for children's rights, spoke publicly in support of Kayden's Law. Her voice, raw and filled with emotion, echoed in the Capitol. Most of all, I want to acknowledge the children who are terrified and suffering at this moment, and the many for whom this legislation comes too late. She continued, "Between 4 and 7 children die daily in America from abuse and neglect. 800 have been murdered by a separating parent since 2008. How many more? The answer hangs heavy in the air. But Kayden's legacy is now sewn into law, a law that, if it had existed in 2018, might have saved her. What would you do if a child told you they were afraid to go to their parents' house? Would you believe them? Would you speak up? Would you fight to protect them, even if the system told you to stand down? Kayden Mancuso did everything right. She loved, she trusted, and when she was scared, she spoke the truth. But the adults with the power to protect her, judges, lawyers, officers, systems, chose silence, chose procedure over protection. She ran for the door. She ran for her life, and she almost made it. Her death is not just a tragedy. It is an indictment, a brutal reminder that parental rights can never outweigh a child's right to be safe. That unchecked power, whether inside a courtroom or behind a closed door, can destroy everything. Yet in the darkest shadow of her loss, Kayden's light still burns, through the voices of her brothers, who speak of the big sister who taught them to be brave, through the laughter of the new puppy, Max D., who replaced Digger, the loyal dog that never left Kayden's side, and through the ink of Kayden's law, which now carries her name into every courtroom that once failed her. Her family could have crumbled, but instead, they stood up. They carried her story like a torch. They made sure that she did not die in vain. So, the next time you see a custody dispute or hear a child's quiet plea, remember Kayden. Remember that behind every legal case is a beating heart, and that every child deserves more than a judge's signature. They deserve safety, love, and a future. Kayden Mancuso was only 7 years old. She never got to finish her favorite song, but in the voices of millions who now carry her fight forward, her melody lives on. Rest in peace, little angel. You had the last word. Through the lives you've saved. If this story moved you, share it. Let Kayden's voice be heard. Let no child be silenced again. Thank you for watching CrimeLine.